for medical devices. We have a US program that's been running since 2013. The Asia Pacific program has been running since 2019. And as part of our accelerator program here, we do educational webinars every week over a period of about 3-4 months. So this is our regulatory strategy webinar, and I'm thrilled to introduce Nada Hanafi from Veranex Solutions. She'll introduce herself in just a moment. She's the Senior Vice President of Regulatory Strategy, and she has spent, I believe, 13 years or so with the US FDA, and she'll tell us more about that in a moment. And Nada is based in the US, of course, so welcome. We also have Alex Budeman here. Thrilled to have Alex on the panel. He is based here in Singapore. He is Vice President Regulatory Affairs with Becton Dickinson, and looks after all of Asia Pacific, and I think he'll be able to shed some light on if there are any questions that relate to the EU as well. So both Becton Dickinson and Veranex are long-standing medtech innovator partner organizations in the US. Not yet in Asia Pacific, but we tap on our US network from time to time as well. So we're thrilled to have both Alex and Nada here. And I will let them introduce themselves in just a moment. So let me hand over to each of our panelists. Perhaps just briefly introduce yourself, your background, tell us a bit about your company and your role. And I'll start with Nada, please.
Awesome. Thank you, Frederick. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And I'm also excited to hear from Alex about the Asia Pacific regulatory process there. So I'm Nada Hanafi. I am, as you said, Senior Vice President for Regulatory Strategy at Veranex. And I've been with what was previously Experian Group, now Veranex, for over 5.5 years. I'm a biomedical engineer by training and a master's in biomaterials and in public health from Hopkins. And I did spend my founding years or foundational years at FDA, over 12.5 years there, entered in the lead reviewer route, which is a typical entry point to FDA, and then transitioned into the Office of the Center Director. I helped develop different programs, policies, and implement them across the center, working with other offices within the agency as a whole. Keen interest in the health of women, minority health, special populations, pediatrics, elderly as well. And at Veranex, basically, I work with companies of all sizes, early startups, sometimes N of 1, to some of the big companies, well-established traditional medical device companies, as well as those trying to enter the medical device space, more from the tech space, to help them develop a roadmap to successfully market their product in the US in a most least burdensome manner, and also what they might need to stay compliant once they get to the market. So Veranex is a service provider. We've brought the best in class to think of developing your product from concept through to commercialization. And my area of expertise and oversight is within the regulatory space, and I work closely with our quality and clinical team to support companies and guide them through that process. So again, thank you for having me and looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Nada. And Alex, over to you.
Great, thanks, Frederick. Good morning, good evening to all of you. It's my pleasure as well to be here. Join Nada, and I'm sure I'll be learning some latest developments from the US, and I'm really excited to hear some of the questions, to kind of just get a sense of what the startup community is thinking about. So a little bit about myself. I started my career in the US. I worked for Bristol Myers, J&J, and Medtronic. Moved to Singapore about 17 years ago, and currently I'm in BD, as Frederick mentioned. I lead the Asia Pacific. We call it the Greater Asia. So I have regulatory teams in all the key markets. We're about 150 strong. Unlike Nada, I'm not a career regulatory person. I've had multiple roles in my work experience. One of them was in new product development, so I can empathize with the sort of the complexity of trying to bring product to the market, not just from the regulatory perspective, but overall. from from the start, the concept, all the way to the commercialization phase. Again, I'm really happy to be here, join the panel.
Great, thank you so much, Alex. So let's dive in, and the first question that I just want to tackle up front is, for a smaller company, typically, what should they think about when planning their regulatory strategy, and when in the development of a new company is it good to start to think about regulatory strategy? Would you recommend to do that after an initial prototype build, or is that something that you'd encourage companies to think about much earlier? And if so, if they may not have those regulatory experts in-house, at what point in time does it make sense for them maybe to reach out for external regulatory advice? And Nada, maybe I'll turn to you first on this.
Sure, it's a perfect question to kick us off. So when it comes to regulatory strategy, I actually think it should be embedded or ingrained in your thinking. And at the heart of it really is you're trying to solve a problem that's either a pain point for patients or physicians. At the center of everything we do, from regulatory, putting on my previous FDA hat in public health space, is to improve outcomes for patients. And I think that's really critical to any device or product you're developing, especially when you start to navigate FDA particular and focus on that end. But what's really critical is having a clear product description, a device description, being able to speak what your product functionalities are, how it works, and then tying that back into your intended use, indications for use. You'll get sick of me and you'll hear this constantly. Intended, but these are critical to helping anyone, including your own team, understand what your product is, how it works, and then what the benefits are, right? To be able to kind of navigate any aspect. So prototype is a good space as well, but even early on, as you're thinking of ideating, sometimes it's helpful to kind of do a landscape assessment to see what products or what devices or what technologies, what therapies are available for either the treatment or diagnosis within this space. And that can then really help inform even how you design the product. But to perform a really in-depth regulatory assessment or strategy and be able to say, here's what your likely pathway to market would look like, having that device description, product description, intended use, basically what does the device do? It's a scalpel, it cuts. Indications for use, the claims around your device. It's fun. I like to say it's the what, the why, the when, the where, the how even. So you think of your patient population, the disease state, where you want to use the product, is it, and who it's being used by. Is it an in-clinic, in-hospital use? Is it an at-home use? Is it something that has to be prescription RX, or is it an OTC? So there's so many variables that speak into that indications for use. And that's part of understanding the market you're entering, the disease space, that really then helps you flush those out. Once you have those, I think Bob's your uncle, if that's a term, you understand there. It's smooth as sailing. And if you don't have those flushed out, if you work with the right regulatory group or in-house, they can help you develop those so that it makes sense for what you're trying to do. So those are three critical pieces as to then I'd say engage further and really understand what that pathway to market would look like.
Very good. Thanks for that, Nada. And Alex, at Becton Dickinson, when does your product development team typically rope in regulatory?
So we in regulatory, we always advocate, as early as possible. And I was just really reflecting on what Nada shared, right? And a lot of times we even in BD, experience some pitfalls there with not defining those things clearly. One thing that I can add, just coming from the region perspective, Frederick, is it's also good to know where you think the market opportunities are, right? It's not every country is exactly aligned with the US or CE mark. which tend to be, the sort of the first two regulatory approvals that companies typically go after. So in BD, what I've been trying to advocate to all the design centers, the legal manufacturers in BD, is that please take into account our regional requirements, right? Because just because you think you've met the FDA or the product is going to be a CE mark, it may not pass the requirements in China, in Japan, which are typically, sort of the next tier countries that, we would like to go to. So we've experienced delays there. So back to your question about when should we involve the experts, within BD, we try to get our seat on the table as well, that, hey, if you're targeting Asia, please involve us as soon as you can, right? And to Nada's point, a lot of the design input requirements have to capture our requirements as well. Otherwise, then there'll be sort of some holes that later on we have to come back and plug those holes, which will impact the market access in those countries. So delay specifically.
Yeah, great point, Alex. You spoke briefly about pitfalls, and I'll turn to Nada here on this. During your years at US FDA, you must have seen companies that have done this right, and companies that maybe did not, and therefore, what typically are some common pitfalls as medical device startups look to the US and look at the regulatory options in the US, submissions, pathways, and so on. We'll talk a bit about the differences here between 510K, PMA, and de novo, and so on in a moment. But what are some of the common pitfalls that you've come across when you worked with smaller companies?
Yeah, another good question. There's many, right?
Yeah, maybe the top 3 or 2.
Sometimes when you fall, you learn more, but if you can learn from others' mistakes, it's better, right, to avoid them.
Right.
I think I'll flip it. So I think being flexible. So even when we talk about intended use indications for use, your product description, it doesn't have to be final. So I should contextualize that. It's always your proposed. Even when you speak with FDA, it's proposed. Your intended use indication is probably being negotiated until the day you either receive clearance or granting or approval. Because it's all driven by the data and the evidence you have to support what you say your product is going to do. So I think if you're not flexible or recognize that it's a negotiation process, that may be a pitfall. So having the mindset of flexibility and being able to kind of change course appropriately would help companies more successfully navigate maybe the regulatory realm in anywhere, actually, regardless of location. So rather than a pitfall, and I have to think about that more, but that would be my big advice, is to avoid pitfalls, be able to be flexible and agile to respond. And then the other piece is when companies haven't proactively prepared, right, to be thinking about not just the short term, but the long-term strategy, options to consider stepwise approaches, and align that with your business strategy. I think it goes back to Alex, the requirements or the market access or where you might find a return on investment. And again, I'll link it back to the main piece of how I started. What is the pain point you're addressing and to whom? And targeting the design of that product or your solution to effectively address that pain point. So clearly defining a problem statement. I find companies kind of meander or struggle or just going in the same cycle when they haven't defined the problem they're trying to address. And I guess this all goes back to, again, having a product, being able to explain what your product is, tell your story to FDA, and then having the intended use indications for use to support that. And I think you'll avoid a lot of pains or pitfalls per se if you're starting from a solid space there and being able to take FDA's feedback as well. And again, to Alex's point, that landscape assessment, understanding what the requirements are, understanding who your competitors are, understanding and doing maybe the growth assessment of where you might actually have the most advantage compared to what's currently on the market. And I think that speaks to your problem statement.
That's great advice. Nada, I appreciate that. Now let's go into some of the regulatory pathways here in a little bit more detail, and I'll turn to Alex perhaps first to share some of your thoughts about what's happening in Asia Pacific. Specifically, if we start with the basics, device classification is fundamentally different in many major markets. How does it differ across Asia Pacific versus EU and the US? And maybe I'll ask you to comment very briefly, because I know this almost warrants its own webinar. What are some of what would you say are the more difficult markets in Asia Pacific, and which are the ones that perhaps would be low-hanging fruits, if you like, for an Asian-based medical device company as they plan their regulatory strategy here? But maybe let's talk first briefly about device classification differences.
Okay. So I think from device classification, there is a pretty good alignment there, Frederick. You know, the FDA has 3, right? 1, 2, 3. So if you look at China, probably is the one closest to the FDA with regards to the product classification. Europe has 3, but actually it's kind of 4, right? Because they did 2A and 2B. So in some of the markets also have, you know, 4, A, B, C, D, or 1, 2, 3, 4, like in Japan. And these are all primarily risk-based, right? So I think the concept is the same. How product is classified, you know, the rationale for the different classifications is essentially the same. It's just some nuances, whether it's class 3 or class 4, or, you know, 2A or 2B, like in Europe. And along with the classification is sort of the bar to clear, right? And back to what Nada mentioned, you know, indications for use, intended, you know, use, the requirements go along with the classification. So strategically, again, and based on the product description and what you're trying to address, you know, companies would want to sort of optimize your product classification, right? And now, for me, what I've seen is there's a flip side to that as well. Like, you know, you could have that maybe a faster market access, but then you have to kind of follow the reimbursement price that's been set as opposed to bringing something that's novel, right? But then that also tends to be a longer regulatory pathway. But you may have the opportunity to kind of set the new reimbursement price in, you know, Korea and Japan, for example. So with regards to your second question, Frederick, on what's the toughest, coincidentally, maybe that kind of go along with the biggest 2 markets we have in Asia. There's Japan and China, or China and Japan in that order. Although China MPA has done a lot of you know, fine tuning, a lot of transformation in the regulatory system, right? The latest decree 739 presents, you know, quite a number of opportunities for companies, especially startup companies, to reduce the cycle time to market. So that's very much welcomed by the industry. Japan, it's also, you know, sort of adjusting. You know, there is that alignment or alliance with the FDA with regards to like the IDE program, where you could do that one study that can be used for, you know, Japan's approval as well. So I'll say those 2 are probably at the top. Not necessarily the low-hanging fruit from the standpoint of you know, the ease to the market, but maybe more of strategic is that if a company is based in a particular country, let's say in Singapore, you would want to get the Singapore approval, right? That way you sort of take care of your, you know, free sale certificate, which often are still asked by other countries. And HSA is really good about being transparent with their process. And there's also a way to abridge the evaluation or go for even an immediate approval in some cases. Australia is really good that they are very closely aligned with EU. So if you do have a CE mark, then typically it's a pretty straightforward process there in Australia. Then you have everything else sort of in between. You sort of have to just pick strategically, which markets you want to go first. But I think that's pretty much sort of like kind of maybe presents an overview to your question.
Thanks, Alex. That's very helpful, and we'll no doubt get more questions about this. To those of you who are in our cohort and have access to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, feel free to put in any questions you have there. We might tackle them during the course of the main webinar. If not, we will get to them during the Q&A a little bit later on. Nada, on the US side, let's just maybe get some of the basics out of the way for those who may be less familiar with the US alternative pathways. Very quickly, the key differences between the 510K, PMA, de novo, and of course, a lot of people are talking about EUAs or emergency use authorization if you have something that's been COVID related. I understand that that's something that's worked for a period of time, but the FDA have now announced that they're transitioning away from that. We'll come to the fast tracking options in a moment, and Alex spoke briefly about some of those here in Asia Pacific, but just some of the key differences between different pathways and maybe where the FDA now stands with the EUA.
Sure, absolutely. So when we look at it from an FDA perspective, what we start with is the definition of a medical device. And that's part of the CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations within the FDA CM Act. Very boring, but very critical. So you always have to look at, does my product actually meet the definition of a medical device? And is it an instrument, apparatus, implement, machine, contrivance, implant, in vitro reagent, or other related article, including components or accessories? Those of you thinking of creating a system, right? And basically, it has to be intended to either diagnose a disease or other conditions, or cure, mitigate, treat, or prevent a disease in man or other animals. And it's intended to affect the structure or any function of the body of man or other animal by achieving its intended use, not through a chemical action or a metabolic action. So it can't be a drug and it can't be a biologic. And that really then you fall within the definition of a medical device. And then from there, FDA, again, it's similar. It's a benefit risk classification. There are 3 tiers, and your first class 1 is the lowest risk, and they're often exempt from what you probably have heard a lot, the 510K or pre-market notification pathway. And then there's the class 2, and that's where the bulk or majority of medical devices reside. That's your low to moderate risk, and it's called 510K pre-market notification. You typically need to submit that 510K to FDA for review. And that makes up about 40% of the devices are cleared through a class 2, and that's a clearance. And then the highest risk devices are those that are life-sustaining devices typically, and they are considered high risk, and those are the class 3 or PMA pre-market approval requirements, and that makes up about 5% of the devices that FDA review. And the class 1, those low risk devices that are typically exempt from 510K, make up about 55% of devices that are on the market. There's different types of regulatory oversight of controls required based on the risk of your device. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, no,
thanks.
Okay, we can talk more about that. Maybe just briefly tell us about de novo and how does that work? What is it, and is that a good option for someone who has a particularly innovative technology?
Yeah, so again, everybody thinks de novo. So de novo is really for novel.
Although I have to say, investors sometimes, I've noticed, certainly in this part of the world, are a bit hesitant because they know that it's a very long process typically. Sorry.
Yeah, so historically, people would hear de novo, everybody would come back and say, I want to be a 510K, and I have a predicate, right? And there's been a shift because there's a lot of novel products out there where a predicate is a device that's been legally marketed or on the US market, even prior to 1976 when the Medical Device Act came into place. But let me tell you, if you're referencing predicates that are more than 10 years old, the technology's probably progressed a lot, and you're likely less successful in using a predicate that's 10 years or older as your predicate device. But do not fear de novos. You're right. I think in the investment community, when you heard a de novo, you thought, oh my goodness, another lengthy process, might as well be a PMA and so forth. Well, the thinking has changed and FDA has evolved and their processes and practices have evolved and they've become a lot more familiar and comfortable with de novos. But for you to be able to pursue a de novo pathway, first of all, there has to be no predicate device on the market within that low to moderate 510K. And there also has to be no PMA class 3 device that's doing what you're doing with the similar technology, similar risk profile. So if you're novel, you're in that low to moderate risk, you're not necessarily life-sustaining. And I have to be clear here, being an implant does not make you a class 3 and does not kick you from the potential of being a de novo, by the way, that low to moderate risk. And basically FDA said, you're low to moderate risk, there is no current CFR, Code of Federal Regulation, or PMA comparable to your device. And so we've created this pathway where you can submit data and we will create a new Code of Federal Regulation for your specific category of device and what it's intended to do. Most de novos do require a clinical study as part of that evidence generation. But what we also create is special controls, and that's basically explaining what the type of risks are and how you're mitigating for them through the development or collection of evidence. So if your device has software, there'll be EMC testing requirements there. Part of special controls may also be usability, depending on who the patient population environment of use may be another special control. Clinical as well is typically a special control. So once you create a Code of Federal Regulation, you become classified in that class 2, and then you become the main predicate, either for yourself to predicate on as you continue to make developments in your product or want to expand indications or intended use and so forth, or you become a predicate for others to follow you onto the market. I can talk more about timelines associated with that, but what I'd like to get across is it's not something to fear. If you truly are unique, you don't need to pigeonhole yourself per se to go down the 510K pathway. But there's always things to think about in terms of if you truly are novel and you could be considered a high risk, what are the benefits that might outweigh, and you might want to go down the PMA route rather than the de novo route. But what we've seen here in the US, actually, a lot of investors are getting behind a product that could be a de novo. It's not per se a red flag. But some are stuck in their roots and they say, no, I don't want to support a clinical study. As most 510Ks don't necessarily require clinical studies. It's less.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. We'll come to clinical requirements here in a moment. Just staying with you now for a second. Pre-submission, US FDA pre-submissions. What are those? And is it something that you would encourage startups to arrange with the US FDA before they make a full submission?
Sure, absolutely. So pre-subs were previously referred to as pre-IDEs in the earlier days, and then FDA changed to pre-subs. And it's somewhat, in a way, FDA's way of consulting with you, right? You ask them questions and you give them the information in the pre-sub to be able to answer your questions. And I think that's a pitfall when you don't do that. So, and a pre-sub is really an opportunity for you to guide FDA along with what you're thinking and show them your expertise within your device area. Again, another critical piece I say is FDA is not an expert on your device, and nor do they want to be. So I put my FDA hat on. They have too many devices out there. they're experts on the requirements and the regulatory pathway. And that's the role we like to play. But you need to really own your device, be an expert in it, and show FDA that through your storytelling in a pre-submission. So pre-subs are a way to ask very specific questions, give FDA the information to be able to answer your questions in a meaningful way to help you move on with your product development. So there's certain stages within your product development and as a company when you'd be ready to go to FDA. Sometimes it's too early, and sometimes you also you're way down the path where you've already conducted a clinical study or some animal testing or some major evidence generation that's been costly and timely, and they actually don't agree with the approach. So then you're a bit too late. So there's a good time to go to FDA and also engage in a meaningful way. And remember, it's your first interaction with the agency, and impressions count. And you don't want to waste their time, and you don't want to waste your time either, because it's a process. It's 75 days typically to get that meeting with FDA. And now all the meetings are still virtual, which has made it a little bit easier for especially countries overseas. They don't have to fly in, but it's just finding a time that's convenient for everyone. So you might be taking late. A lot of my Australian clients, it's 10 p.m., 11 p.m. for them, and it's like 4 a.m. for me on the Pacific coast. And FDA is nice enough to grant us an 8 a.m. meeting, but they have their federal working hours that they'd like to work within. But they understand in this kind of, global environment, they have to be flexible as well. But it's a great opportunity to engage with FDA and get feedback, but you do have to be strategic with it. It's not, and everything you put in front of FDA, they will read and digest. So you also have to be, you don't just throw it over the fence. It has to make sense and be part of your overall package and story.
No, that's great advice, Nada. And Alex, just staying with this idea of getting feedback from the regulatory authorities, a criticism I always hear is that the EU lacks that, and there's no way of getting that feedback from notified bodies, for example, in Europe. What's the situation in Asia Pacific? Is there a similar way of having sort of informal interaction with the regulatory authorities before you make submission to ask questions? And what does that look like?
Yeah, so the short answer, fortunately, yes, Frederick. And I listened to Nada and I was like, yeah, it's absolutely a great opportunity, right, for companies to introduce the product, listen to what FDA has to say, and also to advocate a certain certain pathway, right, and to guide the authority. I think at the end of the day, both the authority and the company want to do the right thing, right? Want to bring the latest technology that can, for BD, purposes, advance the world of health, is to bring that product that's safe and effective. And the more you work together, the higher the chance of success has been my experience. So the answer is yes, Frederick. China and MPA, Japan PMDA, TGA, HSA, just about every regulatory authority here in the region is open to this. Now, granted, is not necessarily binding or whatever is sort of covered in this, but it's all sort of conditional, right? Because at that point, you don't have all the data. It's more of a concept approach. And I fully agree with Nada. You don't want to be too late to this consultation or pre-sub, because then, if something has been started, then it's going to get a lot tougher to try to justify why you've done a certain, things a certain way. But companies definitely should take advantage of this. Like the FDA, it's a consultation that can be arranged. You book for an appointment, and you're given a particular time slot, and you get that opportunity to do all this that I covered.
Great feedback there, Alex. Thank you. Let's just talk very briefly about timelines, and I'll stay with Alex here for a moment. what are some of the ranges and differences in regulatory approval timelines across major Asia Pacific markets, whether TGA, Singapore, China, Japan, perhaps?
Yeah.
I know obviously it will vary by class, but what are some of the broad indications here, maybe for our audience?
Yeah, so it's definitely by class, right? And like the FDA, so class 1 is even exempted, where you just sort of notify. And I have to kind of base it that everything is ready, right? So from the day you submit, including your clinical evidence, the ranges from a few months to 12 months, I would say, in general. In some cases, could be longer. If for a full conformity is required in Australia, as an example, that could take a little bit longer. I mentioned earlier, Frederick, how China has really introduced different ways of trying to streamline, not necessarily through the innovative pathway, but to be able to do type testing internally, as an example, to be able to submit the registration in parallel with the first country of approval, which for us, that's a pretty significant, whereas in the past, we have to wait for either an FDA approval or the CE mark before we can submit in China. Under the Decree 739, now there is an opportunity, if a product meets a certain criteria, one of them is that is an innovative, not a me too, and there is a certain IP behind that technology, we could submit the registration in parallel. So that takes quite a bit of time in the overall scheme of things of bringing the product to China. From the submission to the approval, we are still looking at for a higher class products at least of a year. It's a general sort of rough timeline.
That's helpful, Alex. Thanks for that. And Nada, very broadly, US FDA timelines to approval. What indications do you typically give your clients?
I think a lot of it depends on how prepared you are, right?
Yeah.
And pre-submission is a opportunity to de-risk your future submissions and get on the same page and align with FDA early on, especially about that evidence generation and that proposed pathway to market. So pre-sub, typically it's 75 days to when you meet with FDA. You can get a meeting with them sometimes as early as 30 days. But it can range, but their timelines on their guidance, it's 75 days, and you would get written feedback 5 days prior to that meeting. For 510Ks, their timeline is 90 review days, and that includes weekends. So it's calendar days. These are all calendar days for FDA, so the weekend is rolled in as well. There's a process to say a 510K, I'll take that as an example. FDA instituted this, what they call is an RTA, or refuse to accept. It's more of an administrative review. So they want to make sure you've provided all the requirements for them to be able to dive into their substantive review for whatever submission. They even do it for pre-subs. So you're on a good track if you can pass RTA. That's really critical to us. You don't want to fail that. We see clients sometimes who are just in a cycle. They can't even get the administrative requirements down. Even how you submit a product, a submission now, they're moving to an electronic format. They've gone away from paper. Right now, you can also submit everything electronically. So they went from paper to electronic. So you just submit a cover letter. That's hard. And you put a CD or flash drive with the rest of your submission. There's a whole process and guidance to how that's done. So you either need to know how to do that or work with someone who knows how to do that. It's not as simple. They have their different cover sheets. They have their administrative forms as well that you have to complete, right? So that's the RTA. You typically will get a response within 15 days if you pass the RTA, and then they'll start their review. Sometimes if everything's smooth, they'll go into what's called interactive review and try and give you a response clearance by the 90 days earlier if they can. It's good for their own timelines as well. But typically, you're likely going to get a hold. It's called an AI hold. That's an additional information hold, where they're requesting either additional testing or clarifications. And if you have that hold, it comes anywhere from 45 days to 60 days. They like to do that so that when you respond, they either have 45 days to get to the 90 days or 30 days to complete their review. If they put a sponsor on hold, you have 180 days to respond. That's 6 months. So that's why the timeline really varies. Right. We say 90 days, that's FDA review clock days. But it really is dependent on you and what they ask, right? And hopefully, sometimes it's simple. You can send a response in a day. But if you need to repeat testing or it's new testing that you didn't think you'd require, that 180 days can go by really fast, right? So I guess the answer is, if everything's smooth sailing, you could have a clearance in 90 days. For this is a traditional 510K. Special 510Ks, it's a shorter timeline. It's typically 30 days. Or it could take you longer. So if you factor in the 90 days plus the 180 days, it's a lot longer. Yeah. So, you know, it varies. PMA days are typically, it's around 180 days for them to review those. De Novo's FDA is committed to 150 days. But again, it depends. They still have their review timeline.
Right, right. That's helpful, Nada. I appreciate that. Conscious of time here, before we start talking about fast tracking approvals, I just wanted to ask Alex a question we often get from smaller companies that work through networks of distributors is should I have my distributor hold my regulatory product license? Or is there another way of smarter way of doing that if you're a small company? I guess at Becton Dickinson, you would have your own legal subsidiaries in each of the major markets in the region. But for a smaller company that may need to work through independent distributors, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so believe it or not, we also have some of our licenses in Asia that are held by our distributors. If I could do it over, Frederick, I would separate between the distributor and the license holder, right? If we're not able to establish our own legal subsidiary, which I know is complex, and you might not have the economy of scale or the justification to do that, that would be my advice. But if you're asking, is it possible? The answer is yes. You know, many, if not most of startups, companies do that. Just gotta bear in mind that the license holder is the owner of that access in that country, right? So you want to really think twice about, okay, is this going to be a long-term relationship? You know, what if you would like to make a change? You have to factor in the time to do that. Some countries are really good about having the pathway where you can do a change of ownership. And it's a pretty straightforward process, and some require full registrations, which back to what we just talked about, you know, the timeline and all the requirements. And I've also seen where, you know, product was approved many years ago. It's sort of grandfathered in, you know, renewals are given every so often, but then when you try to re-register, the bar is much higher now. Mm. You know, biocom standards have changed, and all of a sudden you got to face all those questions. So really got to be strategic. So for me, would be using a third-party license holder, separate from the distributor, the 3PL that you typically use, would be maybe a good sort of a compromise if you can't have it yourself.
I think that's great advice. Thanks, Ali, because certainly I've heard a number of horror stories of how this product license has been used as a bargaining chip when a principal decides to part ways with the distributor. So good advice there for our audience to take on board. Let's talk briefly now about fast tracking approvals. Nada, breakthrough designation is something that we hear a lot about. We have a number of companies in this part of the world that are very excited about that as a pathway. what exactly is it? What are the benefits? And I assume that a non-US startup venture can be considered for this as well. And how does a company know if it's eligible?
Great. So breakthrough. So first of all, let me clarify. It is not a pathway. It is a program.
Good. Thanks for clarifying
that.
So
a pathway is if it's a PMA, a 510K, or de novo. So you have to either be a PMA, 510K, or de novo to be eligible to apply for the Breakthrough Devices program and get designated as a breakthrough device. FDA created it as a heightened communication avenue to work more interactively with the agency from kind of concept through to commercialization. So for very somewhat early on products and concepts, but they have certain criteria you have to meet, 2 criteria. The first criterion, which is actually the hardest criterion to meet, is that you have to be a device that is more effective at treating or diagnosing a life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating disease or condition, right? You think, oh, that's easy, I'm treating heart failure, so I meet it. Or I'm diagnosing heart failure. Well, no, it's a lot tougher than that. And to likely be more effective, so that means you have to show the likelihood for technical success, likelihood for clinical success. And it's more complex, but you have to have some evidence, initial evidence or data to say that your product can meet clinical success in a clinical setting, and technically it's going to achieve what you say you're going to do, either in some bench data. A lot of times in the past you could rely on literature to support the likelihood for that. That FDA shifted from there. They're actually looking for some initial data with your device, be it a prototype or a minimally viable product, MVP or some sort there. And then what are you more effective than? You're more effective than standard of care. So how you define standard of care is really critical, and it has to be very in line with how FDA defines standard of care. So it's very US focused, it's US centric. So I'm likely more effective at treating or diagnosing a life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating condition than the standard of care within the US. So that's criterion 1. If you can meet that piece, criterion 2 is the easy one, right? And there they have 4 subparts to it. You don't have to meet all 4. You have to meet at a minimum 1. And those are, you have to represent a breakthrough technology. That's A. There has to be no approved or cleared alternative on the market. You have to offer a significant advantage over an existing approved or cleared alternative. So the catch there, I should throw it back on you. And then D, the device has to be in the best interest of the patient. But if you look at those, represent breakthrough technology, no approved or cleared alternative, or offer significant advantage over existing approved or cleared alternative. Clearly, you can't meet B and C, right? You have to meet either or. So you can meet A, B, D, or you can meet A, C, D. And typically you should be able to meet, be in the best interest of patients, D. But you don't have to meet all 4 is the take home there. And then you have to submit, it's called a pre-sub in a way. It's similar, but you have to submit a submission to FDA and show them how you meet criterion 1, and then 1 of criteria 2.
Very helpful.
And there is a legislative time frame for review. FDA, by statute, has to review and either designate you as breakthrough or not within 60 days.
Okay.
So again, the process is they accept your submission. Typically, they'll respond and say, we've accepted again within that 15-day time frame. At 30 days, they'll either put you on hold and say, hey, we have these additional questions. And it's not really a hold because the clock hasn't stopped. With the 510K example, the clock stops, right?
Right.
And then you come back. But with the breakthrough, it's a continuous time line or time clock. It doesn't stop. So you have to respond really fast. So they like to come back at the 30 days. They try and work with you. You might work with them interactively in answering the questions. They might say, respond within a week. It just depends on the group, or respond within 15 days. You want to get that response in as soon as possible because it's a shared timeline. You want to give them enough time to answer it, but you also want to provide a response that's hopefully going to get you to designation and, a positive outcome. And then at 60 days, you're either designated or not. And if you don't get designated, a lot of people ask, is that a X against my, a bad mark against me? Not at all. You can always go back and reapply at a later stage. Typically, the interaction's helpful. You get insights as to why FDA don't believe you meet the different criterions, and where they think there's a risk or what kind of data they want to see. But it's still, there's a process to putting the package together, maybe a 30-day, and then you have 60 days in there. So as I know, startups, time is of the essence, and time is money. You want to make sure you're spending your money appropriately. So you need to do that due diligence of an assessment to see if you truly have the chance to meet the criteria and get designated as breakthrough.
That's great advice, Nada. Thanks for that. And in Asia Pacific, Alex, what are the different ways a company can fast track approval? We may have heard about the green channel in China or expedited approval in Singapore. What's your perspective on this?
Yeah, so the China green channel, I think it's probably modeled after the FDA, right? Because just listening to Nada's explanations on the criteria, it's very, very similar. We just got one successful application, and I can't underemphasize how rigorous it was, right? So to Nada's point, it's quite a high bar to clear. A lot of evidence, and one advice that I could share is, it is beneficial to line up some KOLs, right, who can really attest, on your behalf that this product does serve an unmet need, and why they should be given a priority from the agency's perspective. So NMPA has that pretty well established. Our TGA has something similar criteria as well, that if you do meet certain conditions, such as serves unmet needs, is clinically superior, something that's innovative, it could fall under that category. One that I like to highlight and give a plug to APAC Med's successful effort is the regulatory reliance, Frederick. And back to your question earlier about the value of having that first approval. So in this particular case, if you do have approval in Singapore, Thailand FDA will recognize the review that's been done by HSA in reviewing their application in Thailand. So that's called the regulatory reliance. It's one step towards that mutual recognition. We're definitely not there. I'm not sure whether we'll ever get there, but regulatory reliance is certainly a positive step. So that's one way where you can strategically get the HSA's approval, then you can sort of extend it to Thailand in this case. That's the one that has been on board. Philippine FDA is in active discussion with the HSA, and this is something that from APAC Med's perspective, we're trying to expand as much as we can, right? That we believe this is in the spirit of what WHO is advocating, what IMDRF is also advocating, as much of a harmonization as possible.
Thanks for that. And maybe you didn't say at the beginning of the webinar, but you are also the vice chair of the APAC Med Regulatory Affairs Committee. So you're intimately involved in some of these policy, driving some of this advocacy work. I'm conscious of time. We really only have 4 minutes left. I did want to touch briefly about foreign reference data. And I know there have been changes in, for example, with the NMPA in China, Alex, that pushback in maybe 5-6 years ago that was a real hurdle. Then they started to accept that. To what extent do the major regulatory authorities now in Asia Pacific accept foreign data as part of their submission, or do authorities like NMPA, PMDA still insist on clinical data coming from local trials?
The answer is no. They don't insist unless, right, that there are specific reasons, such as, well, most of the times what I've seen, Frederick, and this is seen in BD and in my previous experience as well, the clinical data is just not sufficient. It was either done when, at the time, first in men study was sufficient, but of course, even if you were to go back today in the same agency, it would not be sufficient. So it's not necessarily an insistence that a local study must be done, but it's more about the incompleteness of the study or the lack of power in the clinical study to clearly demonstrate, safety and performance. So that's when it's not just NMPA or PMDA, right? Just about any other agencies will look at that critically and say, wait a minute, you only have this few patients for a class 3 device. That's just simply not enough. There are exceptions, though, where a patient demographic could alter the performance of a product in some cases where, you heard that, PMDA or NMPA might require some representation of Asian ethnicity in the study, or they will ask for that, make sure that it is represented in there. But those will be exceptions, not the rule.
Understood. Thanks. And
can I just
yeah,
jump
please.
in
I was just going to turn to you,
from
Nada.
the US. Yeah, it's really critical for here. The big question is the generalizability of the out of US data to the patient population. America has a pretty diverse patient population, and FDA's big question now, it's all about inclusivity or representation, as you said, Alex, racial, ethnic, by gender, sex, and then age comes into play as well. So right now, if you're thinking of an IDE study, FDA is mandating you provide them with a roadmap of how you are being inclusive and accounting for different racial and ethnic groups in your studies, and it has to be representative. So if you're doing an out of US study, you're going to have to explain why that patient population is generalizable to the US, as well as why the clinical practice out of US is comparable or generalizable, right? And I think that's where, if you're doing studies in Australia, you're going to be missing a big patient population, the African-American patient population, potentially the Indian patient population. So you need to be able to either explain that, but typically also, does the US accept out of US data, clinical data? Yes. It shouldn't be more than 50%. If you can have it 30, 70, it's probably a lot better and in your favor to smooth things along. But yes, they accept out of US data. And earlier you asked, anyone can apply for the breakthrough. Out of US, companies, of course, can apply for it as well. So it's just the same if you want to get into the US market, you'd go through FDA.
Thanks for that, Nada. We have reached the end of the hour, I'm afraid. We could have easily gone on here for another hour or two. Great discussion. Before we part ways with our YouTube viewers, and I thank our panelists, just a few last parting words, perhaps. Your thoughts, maybe any last tips or advice to the medical device startup community that are thinking either of Alex's case of entering Asia Pacific markets, or not if they're turning to the US. And maybe Alex, I'll ask you first for a few final words of wisdom.
Maybe going back to your first question, right, Frederick, and for me, being responsible regulatory in the region is to make sure that the requirements are clearly understood, that if you want to target a certain markets, based on the product and the opportunities, The earlier you understand the requirements, the better, right? That way you don't have to go back and try to, sort of patch, some of the design, verification, validation, and all that stuff that's been done. So yeah, the earlier the better. Don't underestimate the regulatory complexity, and there are still some nuances across the different countries. Unfortunately, we are not at the stage where everything is harmonized. We're quite far from.
Yeah. No, that's good advice. Thanks, Alex. Nada.
Yeah, I think to add on to what Alex is saying, understanding the requirements based on the country you want to enter first, then I'll go back to the core piece of understanding the space you're trying to enter. Really have a very clear problem definition, and understand the disease state, the patients, and whoever's going to be interacting with your product, and it will feed back to your design requirements and the evidence generation approach. And then, developing that regulatory strategy so you have a roadmap, which speaks back to what are the requirements, what's the type of testing I'm going to do, and it's going to be driven by a risk assessment at the core of it. Everything, remember, the FDA is a balance. Most regulatory agencies are. It's the balance, and FDA shifted from saying risk benefit to benefit risk, where the benefit has to outweigh the risk. And they also recognize that as regulators, we tend to be more risk averse, but we recognize that patients may be less risk averse as they are the ones living with their disease state. And that lived experience is really important. And they may be willing to take additional risk because they see a greater benefit that would outweigh. So we also, I say we, but the regulators also put on that hat where they said, we need to take these different perspectives under consideration as we're evaluating devices and the different information streams. But Alex said it at the core, it's making sure safety and effectiveness, and that feeds into benefit risk, and benefit has to outweigh risk. And Leander, know your product, have a passion, know your product, know your disease space, own it. You are the experts in your product, and then bring everybody along with you. I think you'll make your regulatory process a lot more easier that way.
Great, thank you so much, Nada. And on that note, we will extend our thanks to Alex Budiman and Nada Hanafi for joining the panel this morning. Don't go away. we're going into our closed door Q&A in just a moment. So our cohorts stay on the line. But I did want to extend my thanks to those of you who are watching this on YouTube. We will part ways here. We watch out for our webinar next week, where we're going to be touching on health economics and product value. So stay tuned for that. Thank you to our YouTube viewers, and Rodrigo, you may now terminate our YouTube stream.